welcome everyone, and hello particularly to Professor Wodak. We're so grateful for you joining us today. So, the technology hasn't been perfect, but it is allowing us to have a kind of international conference and bring people in and contributions in from around the world, which is fantastic. So I'm Barbara Warnock from the Vienna Holocaust Library, one of the co-conveners of this conference, and I'm really honoured today to be chairing one of our keynote lectures, which will be Professor Wodak speaking about collective amnesia, normalising a rhetoric of exclusion. So we'll hear from Professor Wodak, and then there'll be a bit of a chance for questions from the audience and in the chat on Zoom afterwards. So Professor Ruth Wodak is Emeritus Professor and Chair in Discourse Studies in the Language of Linguistics, Department of Linguistics and English Language at Lancaster University, and Professor in Linguistics at the University of Vienna. She is the author of a great many volumes and articles, including The Politics of Fear, What Right-Wing Populist Discourses Mean, from 2015. So I'll hand over now to her and look forward to hearing the lecture. Ruth, thank you.
Thank you very much. I hope everybody can hear me. Please wave your hands if you can hear me. Good. Thank you very much for inviting me to this great conference. I've been able to listen to the panel before lunch, and I thought it was very inspiring and also already hinted at a lot of topics which I want to also elaborate and draw upon. I'm also very grateful to Barbara and to Matthew for inviting me for all the correspondence and for organizing this in such a wonderful way. And I'm really sorry that I cannot be present and also have not been able to look at the exhibition and follow other events, but due to Omicron and all kinds of new and old variants of the pandemic, traveling, as you all know, has become really difficult or impossible. So what I want to do today, and I will now try and share my screen, and I hope it works like it did before. Yep. So I hope that everybody can see the screen now. I will talk about collective amnesia and normalizing a rhetoric of exclusion. And you might ask yourself why I'm talking about collective amnesia. My talk will oscillate between two extremes and a lot of dimensions in between. On the one hand, I claim that there is something which I call collective amnesia. That means that the post-war consensus has been violated or has become obsolete, and that many phenomena which have been apparent in post-war or during World War II and the Holocaust have been forgotten, and that we are experiencing a normalization of various arguments, of expressions, of topics, but also of policies which we had thought would never occur again. And on the other hand, the other extreme is drawing on collective memories and insinuating certain tropes, again, which we thought would never come again, but which have become apparent. So it's an oscillation between remembering and forgetting both the past events and the radical right, and as was already talked about in the panel before lunch, fascism, or what we might call neo-fascism, illiberalism, and there are many other expressions which are now being used. So that is sort of the um, the line or the red thread which will characterize my entire talk. So first I will be talking about normalizing far-right agenda and rhetoric, uh, an issue which has been uttered or already started to being discussed before lunch. I will then give you basically two large examples, one about the constructing borders inside a nation state and what we call border and body politics, and how exclusion is being legitimized by politics. And the second example is about defending the homeland, the so-called homeland, and how conspiracy theories have started to take over again, very much um, uh, hinting to anti-Semitic stereotypes and anti-Semitic tropes. Finally, I will discuss possible challenges which we are facing and also possible perspectives. So this is kind of a brief outline of what I will be talking about. So let me start with two images which we are confronted with basically every day in the media, social media, but also in traditional media and in news, the issue of saving children, refugee children, usually unaccompanied adolescents, uh, either on the Greek islands like in Moria or Lesbos, or more recently, young Afghan refugees, which due to the takeover by the Taliban are now trying to run and fight for survival and their life. And my question is, how do denormalization and normalization work? Why are such children and, of course, other refugees not saved in very rich countries, countries which have experienced the refugees during World War II or after 1945? What has changed? What has made it possible that our societies and many people are just accepting that children are drowning in the Mediterranean, that children are starving on the Greek islands, although this is part of the European Union? So how come this has become normalized? What are the functions of normalization, and which discursive shifts or frame shifts are taking place so that mainstream politics has moved so much to the far right and has incorporated the agenda of the radical right or the far right? And why can such taboos be breached? Taboos of the post-war consensus, which were talked about, the anti-fascist consensus, which were talked about already in the panel before lunch. Why is it possible for politicians now to tell blatant lies? Why do such lies resonate so well, and with whom? So these are many questions. I will obviously not be able to answer all of them, but I find them very important. And there is, again, there are two explanations for the normalization. The one explanation is that the mainstream parties, especially conservative parties, are moving to the far right in order to gain or to keep their electorate. And the other possible explanation is that, and such conservative parties are radicalizing, and the other explanation is that the far right has colonized mainstream parties. and that basically some of them, like in the UK, UKIP, have become obsolete because the conservative parties have taken over their agenda. So whatever we will talk about, whatever explanation makes sense, and maybe there are many others, but I want to talk about this process and the processes of normalization. So the first issue I want to think about is why fear mobilizes and is able to instrumentalize, is being instrumentalized by the radical right, and how come this is so successful. If we look at reasons for fear, and Barbara has kindly mentioned my book, which actually now appeared in a second edition 2021 with a new subtitle, The Shameless Normalization of Far-Right Discourse. Why fear makes it possible, the emphasis on fear, the construction of crisis, the exaggeration of crisis makes it possible for so many people to be mobilized to the right. Now, if we look at the Eurobarometer on what is it, what people are mostly afraid about, we can see that migration was one of the most important issues, where there was a lot of anger and fear. That is the yellow line here. And migration was for many years the most important topic which mobilized people. But now this has been overtaken by climate and environment. So many people are very afraid about things happening to our climate, but most importantly by unemployment and health. And so we see that there are many issues which now determine the discontent and the fear of many people, and all of this can be mobilized by the far right or the radical right. Just a minute, I wanted to go back to the definition of what I understand under far-right populism or radical right populism. And there are four important concepts which have to be emphasized. A lot was already also talked about: ethno-nationalism, nativism. But the important concepts are: there is a crisis, fear is mobilized, and a specific group is blamed to be guilty for whatever problems exist, be it unemployment, be it migration, be it now the pandemic. The extreme right or far right parties, and especially their leaders, construct themselves as saviors who will deal with this problem and, quote unquote, solve this problem. And in doing that, they create hope. So we have a trajectory from crisis, fear, to savior, to hope. And this is how what makes these parties so successful. There is a good definition, and of course there are many, but I like this definition, which says far-right populism is an expression and catalyst for the transition from class politics to value politics. So the traditional cleavage between left and right is transcended, and we are now talking mainly about values. We are not talking about party politics, but symbolic politics, in the sense that there are many debates, for example, about the headscarf, and not about the really existentially important issues such as unemployment or inequality. There is a shift from ideological issues which had characterized the left and right, for example, to identity politics, who belongs and who doesn't belong and why, and from socioeconomic to cultural cleavages. That means that nativism and ethno-nationalism have become salient. And in this way, we see that also not only have the discourses shifted, but also the political and material practices. So what does that mean? How can we explain this kind of shift, which we call normalization? I draw specifically on some German theorists like Jürgen Link in trying to explain what normalization means. But of course, there are other important theorists working on this issue, such as the book by Mondon and Winter, and Krzyżanowski and others. So basically what we can observe right now is that the far-right populist agendas and of course the related rhetoric have reached the political mainstream. That means that especially conservative parties have taken up these agenda. That implies that the boundaries of what can be said, what can be written, which images are being used, are being shifted, and the unsayable is becoming sayable. Or what I also sometimes draw upon, the famous utterance by Feierabend, anything goes. It doesn't matter if it's true or false, if it's a lie, if it contradicts something somebody said the day before, anything goes. That implies that traditional post-war values, norms, and rules of political culture are violated by continuous provocations, and these provocations facilitate the change and implementation of policies. That means that we are constantly being distracted by provocations. Just think of Trump and his 35,000 tweets in 4 years, and which have all been collected by the Washington Post and also by the New York Times. And because we're constantly distracted and the media are basically driven to publish these and discuss these, various policies can be implemented which again violate the post-war consensus. That means that provocation is one of scandalization, and provocation have become main tools for mobilization and have been also taken over by mainstream politicians. We all know, and that is why I have already emphasized this twice now, that radical right parties, extreme right parties, would never be successful if they would not be supported by mainstream conservatives. This is true for Donald Trump and the Republicans. This was true going back now in history about the Nazis, who were strongly supported by the German conservatives and the industry, and this has been true throughout, so that this collusion needs to be discussed and also looked at in much detail. I also want to look at another phenomenon which is particularly important when investigating the rhetoric and the practices of mainstream conservatives, and that is what we call coarse civility and incivility. This is a concept which Wilhelm Heidmeier, a German sociologist, has created, and I think it's very useful because it shows that the possibly soft version of discriminatory utterances, utterances of exclusion, utterances which convey authoritarian attitudes can be cloaked beneath a thin layer of so-called civilized polite manners by means of indirectness and implicitness. And this is where we actually, as discourse analysts, have a lot of work to do, because the explicit hate incitement, the explicit use of fascist slogans or extreme right slogans are obviously not difficult to detect and also to deconstruct. It's much more difficult to deconstruct the coded versions and the coded versions of discriminatory rhetoric and the normalization of such values. Uh, this so-called rohe Bürgerlichkeit in German, or coarse civility, also implies that the conservatives and basically the mainstream, those people who are educated and also part and parcel of mainstream society, have accepted these forms of exclusion and are using them both as politicians but also in everyday life. Uh, Thus, in that way, we are dealing with the struggle between new norms and the post-war consensus, and we have many areas of contestation in our societies right now. So if I may, I would just like to show this on a simple diagram, how this process of normalization feeds into our societies. That means that far right, extreme right, even fascist terminology, policy propositions, arguments, which have always been at the fringe, are now being recontextualized. That means they have been taken out of their context, very frequently backstage in some kind of pamphlets, and have now traveled. They have a trajectory on front stage and into new social fields and fields of politics. And they also travel from, let's say, pamphlets and just graffiti into very important genres of our everyday experiences. We see them in interviews and news, we see them on posters, we hear them in meetings, and basically they can actually be implemented into legislation, which is what we are experiencing right now. For example, in Hungary or Poland, just think of the attacks on justice and on lawyers, or think about the attack on gender politics, which are now being changed. Legislation is being changed, and something which was on the fringes has come into mainstream. Now, I would just like to state that, of course, these processes of normalization do not only refer to the far right. There are also left-wing and progressive issues which have become normalized. Just think about gay marriage, for example, or the way gay life has been experienced and has now been uh, permitted and also legally permitted, but only in some countries. In other countries, we experience exactly the opposite. In this way, there's no generalization possible. We really have to look at each context in very careful ways. But it's important to realize that we're talking about this area of politics, interviews, social media, speeches, poster meetings, where we experience that far right arguments of exclusion, a politics of exclusion, has arrived in mainstream discourses. So I would like to proceed and come to my first example, constructing the enemies, as I call it, inside the nation states, very much drawing on nativist tropes. And here I would like to basically show you, and I've jumped this graph about dividing the world. What does the far right mindset look like? This is possibly a bit of a simplistic way of showing that, but I think uh, it does point to the dichotomy which is being constructed by the radical right or the far right. Our world is being divided into us and them, we and the others. We have the decent, honest, good, dutiful, charismatic, noble, brave, trustworthy people, the true people, the pure people, this arbitrarily defined homogeneous people, the true Austrians, British, or Finns, which are represented by the far-right populists who define themselves as the representatives of these true people. The boundaries of who belongs to these true people are blurred. They can always, some new people can come inside or others can be excluded again. The others are basically situated in three dimensions. They are, on the one hand, the others up there, the privileged, the elites, the liberals, the opposition, and so forth. There, the others out there, the asylum seekers, refugees, migrants, and all the various terms which are used for them, and thirdly, those down there, which are the so-called parasites, the work shy, the spongers, the homeless, and so forth. So basically, the good we see themselves attacked from three sides, from above, below, and from outside. And that is why they have to, so they believe, fight. And this is why they are constantly campaigning, and the fight is defined as a good fight because they are victims, the others are posing a threat, they must fear the others, and they have the right to defend themselves against the others. This quite simplistic mindset is basically being elaborated in different ways. The others can differ from case to case. We can differ in various ways, and the fight can be fought in different ways. But basically, this is at the bottom and foundational for the far-right narrative. And to be able to exclude some and include others, we need strategies of legitimation and argumentation, and I will give you some examples in a minute. That means we need normative approval for certain policies or actions. All politicians have to now claim that they are including some and excluding others because it's necessary and good for our people. They have to show that these actions are consistent with the moral order of the respective society. And this is done with certain arguments and warrants, which we call topos. This is a Greek term drawing on Aristotle. And these topoi or topi are very important because they basically are used like a shortcut for a lengthy argumentation. But we don't need to elaborate the entire argument. You just point to this particular shortcut, to this warrant, and you don't need any evidence. You just appeal to intuition, to common sense, and to the epistemic knowledge of a group. And to give you some examples from the Austrian case, but I guess these are quite general, can be generalized. For example, the topos of burden. The people who are now arriving are mostly uneducated or illiterate. Therefore, they are an unacceptable burden on the welfare state. And so politicians say the boat is full, or they don't belong here, they have a different culture, and everybody knows what is meant. Or the topos of the male nature, again, uh, attributed to the topos of culture. The people arriving now are mostly young men who cannot exercise restraint. Therefore, they are a danger to Austrian women. And in that way, young male refugees were discriminated against, and the headlines in many tabloids only talked about those dangerous young men. The topos of economic resource limitation. Austria does not have the resources to provide for so many refugees. Therefore, Austria should only accept a limited number or none at all. This relates to a very famous slogan, namely, the boat is full, where I guess many people know that this was created in Switzerland in 1938 to legitimize not taking Jewish refugees from Austria and Germany. Or if the EU doesn't control its external borders, Austria must take national measures. In that way, the Schengen Agreement became obsolete 2015 during the refugee movement, but also now during the pandemic. The topos of threat. Some of the people arriving now may in the future commit acts of terrorism. They may be radicalized. Therefore, Austria or the UK or Sweden or Germany should close its borders and police them strictly. And in that way, we have so-called rational arguments, rational reasons, rational justifications, and legitimations for not accepting refugees who want to come or have to come to Europe. And these topi have become quite general and are used by many politicians in many countries. I just want to show you a British example, which a colleague gave me, a collection of tabloids, which I guess everybody knows very well. I lived in Britain for 12 years. I know what they look like. And here you have really examples for all these topi, which I just talked about. We must stop the invasion. They are murderers and rapists. They don't want to accommodate and learn the English language. They will set in like a flood and so forth. So they are dangerous. They will overwhelm us. We don't have the resources. And basically, they will invade us. We are the victims. This is the explicit way of excluding others. But there is also an implicit way, as I already said, of the coarse civility. Why are we not saving children? Here we have the former and again Austrian Foreign Minister Schallenberg, who talked about the children in Karatepe and Moria, and said, shouting for distribution cannot be the solution. If we clear the Moria camp, it will be full again. Thus, actually, presupposing that there are masses of refugees coming again, which there is no evidence for. It is sending the wrong signal, namely that there is hope to get to Europe. This would trigger a chain reaction and we would no longer be in control of the situation. This is a question of common sense. So here in this very brief paragraph, you can find a lot of the far-right populist agenda, but cloaked in a kind of civilized language. And very rational, like there is no other way. It is being essentialized. It's the Tina argument in the sense of there is no alternative, because the facts are such that if we take some children, there will be so many coming again. There is no hope to get to Europe. You could ask why and who says that. It would trigger a chain reaction. Here is the use of a metaphor of natural sciences, where there is causality implied, but we don't know which causality and why. And most importantly, which was one of the main arguments in the Brexit debate, being in control. They would no longer be in control. Refugees would come and overwhelm the country. And all of this is legitimized and framed by an appeal to common sense. That means everybody knows this. We don't even have to provide any facts. The former Austrian Chancellor Kurz, I guess you all know that he has in the meantime, in October, November, resigned because of huge corruption scandals. But at that time, he was still Chancellor and rejected to take in any refugees. Chancellor Kurz at that time said, "This inhumane system from 2015, I cannot reconcile this with my conscience. At the European level, we will advocate a holistic approach. What we don't need is symbolic politics. Instead, real sustainable support for affected areas and economic perspective for the African continent and an effective protection of our external borders are needed." So here you have another interesting argument which is implied and which one can deconstruct. First of all, it is assumed by Kurz that the system from 2015 was inhumane, where again we don't have any evidence for that. Quite in the contrary, 2015 in Austria, Germany, and Sweden, hundred thousands of refugees were accepted, and the welcome culture from the civil society was enormous. It was actually very successful. So the system was not inhumane, and it worked. Thus, this can actually, one can actually say this is false, a false claim. And then he claims that he cannot reconcile this with his conscience, and he elaborates that further and says, as we cannot save all children, it would actually, he would feel guilty saving just a few. So in that way, his argument goes, it's better not to save any than just to save a few. Now, again, we can discuss this argument and this position from many perspectives, but it certainly does not at all fit to the Geneva Convention of rescuing refugees, and it does not fit with any humanitarian and human rights. What he then does is attribute the notion of symbolic politics to saving children. That means, again, we can just not save all the children. This is just a debate which is not important. What would be important would be to offer an economic perspective for the African continent. This is certainly important, but as you might know, Europe and the EU has failed up to date. And for example, in Libya, you find camps which are like concentration camps, full of torture and horrible conditions, in that way pointing to the economic perspective for the African continent might actually be quite cynical. What is most important, and this refers again to the control of the situation, is the effective protection of our external borders. That means we are excluding everybody who does not belong to Europe. And now one could discuss who belongs to Europe. Now, both Schallenberg and Kurz are not far right. They are members of the Austrian Conservative Party, which always had quite a Christian social tradition. But during the last years, this party has moved both in policies and in rhetoric very much to the right, and has swallowed many far-right agenda, which made the far-right party, which is like UKIP or Rassemblement National in France, or the Sweden Democrats, move to a different agenda now, which is the anti-vax. So there is a complete discursive and policy shift apparent, all of which is basically a move to the right. I come to my second example, defending the homeland. Now, what happens with strangers coming in? The politics of fear is being instrumentalized by various threat scenarios. Many metaphors are being used, like invasion, floods, wave, tsunami, a decline of the so-called Christian Judean tradition, the metaphors of disease, which really go back to National Socialism and to the 19th century, the discourse of parasites, and the replacement, the identitarian rhetoric, the question of extinction, and the numbers game. So all of this is accompanying the construction of strangers, and basically I want to show you what this now means in specific cases. Here is a case from Poland, which I'm grateful to Michał Krzyżanowski for allowing me to use these two examples. On the one hand, you see here on the right a paragraph from a speech by Jarosław Kaczynski, the leader of the PiS party, the far-right party which has the majority in Poland. And he talks about Muslims. And what you will notice is the integration of anti-Muslim, xenophobic, sexist, and anti-Semitic stereotypes. So in that way, we are really looking at a syncretic exclusionary rhetoric, where many traditional stereotypes attributed to only one minority are now being integrated. And in Poland, basically the anti-Muslim rhetoric draws on all the patterns of anti-Semitic rhetoric, which is still very prevalent. Kaczynski says there are already symptoms of very dangerous diseases not seen in Europe for a long time. Cholera on the Greek islands, dysentery in Vienna. Interestingly, I've never come across that. Some are saying there are also other, even more serious diseases. So Strangers, those from outside, are bringing diseases to the folk, to this nativist body, which is assumed. There are various types of parasites and protozoans, another kind of bacteria, which are not dangerous to those people organisms. So those barbarians, they obviously have different bodies, but can be dangerous to the Polish body. It is not about discriminating against anybody, and that is the typical disclaimer, which you always find in the speech of politicians. I have nothing against Turks, Jews, Roma, etc., but all this needs to be checked. It needs to be checked, and hence the Minister of Health should clarify how this looks at the moment, because from what we know, what our activist knows, it all looks very bad. So here you have really drawing on Nazi language, on absolutely typical fascist and Nazi parasite rhetoric, which attributed the metaphor of disease to the other. And in that case, it's the refugees who are coming to Europe, the others, the Muslims, who are now recontextualized as parasites, and which is being made official in Kaczynski's speech. This means it has been normalized because it has become acceptable for the government, the party in government using such images, metaphors, and language. And for the other picture, again, is an anti-Semitic trope, the sort of German woman which is being raped by the stranger, the Jew. In this case, it's the Polish blonde woman which is being raped by dark hands, Muslim hands, and it's the Islam or Islamski, the Muslim violence which is coming to Europe, the Islamic rape of Europe. This is the cover of a bi-weekly magazine called The Sieci from February 2016. In that way, the Polish public sphere has accepted these images which actually come from the past, where I say this is a collective amnesia on the one hand, because that was forbidden and tabooed, never again. And on the other hand, there is a collective memory with which these insinuate and which obviously work very well. So we have this oscillation between amnesia and collective memory. My second example is the Jewish world conspiracy, and here you have basically the Feindbild, the enemy image of George Soros, as you know, a previously Hungarian Jew who fled to the States, has become very rich, is a philanthropist, and has founded the Open Society, and has become absolutely the enemy of the far and radical right. In Hungary, Orban is fighting openly against Soros. There is almost not one press conference where Soros is not mentioned. The Central European University has had to move to Vienna. That is a university which has been founded by the Open Society. And the argument goes, Soros is responsible for the Muslim refugees coming to Europe. So Soros is bringing them to Europe. So you have an integration of anti-Semitic world conspiracy with anti-Muslim sentiments, which are threatening our people and our nation states. And if you look at this image, which can be deconstructed on very many levels, I have no time to go into this now, but you see all these hints about the uh, the Jew who's extremely rich, because Soros' name is drawn with a dollar sign. He is very, very powerful. This is why his head is so enormously big, and out of his mouth come, this is Mexicans, because this is an American cartoon by and Canadian-American cartoon by Ben Garrison, who is an extreme right artist. He is threatening the US, the land of free stuff, and from his ship and head and mouth are all these Mexicans which are coming and also having a fist in the air. That means they are communists or at least left wing. And in this ship also has various flags, which are also interesting because they are somehow hinting at the Israeli, Palestinian, and some other kind of flag. So we have this globalized power, which is bringing the migrants to the countries and overwhelming us, the people, with migrants. And here is the poor, pure American who's basically crushed by Soros. Now, this is what I call the Judeus ex machina strategy, because I have studied anti-Semitic rhetoric for basically now, I think, 40 years. And what has become apparent is that many governments and many politicians instrumentalize anti-Semitism immediately whenever it seems to be opportune for political ends. And that means that in the fear of strangers, the fear of refugees, the fear of migrants, the fear of the pandemic, everything can trigger these conspiracy theories and basically anti-Semitism, as was also already talked before lunch. And I call this, and I've written about this at length, the Judeus ex machina strategy. Whenever you need a scapegoat, Jews seem to lend themselves. I'm coming to my last slides and the conclusions. There is coming back again to my beginning of my lecture, why can't we save children and refugees? Has some kind of amnesia taken place? And this is just to remind you not only of children yesterday and today, especially in Britain, you might want to think of the Kindertransport children which were saved in Britain, 1938, 39, 10,000 of Jewish children from Germany and Austria. However, the United States did not save Jewish, German, and Austrian children. They could have, but they declined because of some anti-Semitic senators. It's a very famous case, but you see the famous refugee conference in Evian, July 6 to 15, 1938, where the countries discussed the future of Jewish refugees and which countries could actually take some. And exactly the arguments which I read out before, those topoi were used again or already at that time. And the only country which opened up and said they would take Jewish refugees at that time was actually Mexico. Both the US, the UK, and many other countries declined after a 9-day conference. We come to today and see that on October 7, 2021, there was the Resettlement Forum on Afghanistan in Brussels. And again, only very few countries said they would take in some Afghan refugees. And it is as if it was a déjà vu. And you could ask yourself, why does one not learn from history, or why has such a collective amnesia taken place? Are the other agenda so much more salient? And here I put in a quote by Lord Dubs from the House of Lords, quoted in The Guardian, where he said, "I certainly never imagined that 81 years later, in the same country that gave homes to 10,000 lone refugee children like me," he was a Kindertransport child, "I'd be fighting for just a few hundred to be allowed to find their families here," meaning the Greek kids. And I believe that just some weeks ago, many children and others drowned in the Channel. So we could ask, what would Lord Dubs say to the anti-vaccination campaigns as we see them now in Vienna or Berlin or in other European capital cities? I've just enlarged here the Star of David with inside not Jew, but ungeimpft, which means not vaccinated, were those anti-vax demonstrators claim that they are the Jews of today. They are being excluded from society just like the Jews were excluded from 1938 on in Austria and 1933 in Germany. Now, I find this a very scary symbol, because this symbol is, on the one hand, an appropriation of the past in a fallacious way. The meaning is recontextualized and completely changed. It is a fallacious comparison, setting equal past and present. It's trivializing the Holocaust, and it's overwriting the past, meaning implying we want to actually make the past disappear, and we're using this for the present for something else, and we're making this comparison. Now, that was already discussed in the panel before lunch, because I actually raised this question. I just want to comment that about 40,000 people every Saturday are demonstrating in Vienna, and the demonstrators are a mix of neo-Nazis, identitarians, the far right party, which is mobilizing against the government and the measures, but also very many people who march along, who are not fascists, who are not Nazis, who are not identitarians, and who don't vote for the far right, but who are just discontent. And they are being instrumentalized in that way by the far right, which makes it very scary and very dangerous. I come to my last slide. What does normalization now mean? And the collective amnesia, which I talked about. We have this tension about drawing on collective memories and instrumentalizing them for specific ends, like the Judeus ex machina strategy. We have collective amnesia, on the other hand, because exclusion has become acceptable and normalized. We have a huge rise of loss of trust and inequality, which mobilizes people. Not all of them are fascists, but they are being instrumentalized and mobilized. Exclusion is founded and constituted by, on the one hand, economic arguments, I've shown them, and also security arguments. Borders are being opened for some, but closed for others, what Vollmer calls the moralization of borders. Not every refugee is equal, not every migrant is allowed to pass. And in that way, exclusion has been culturalized. we have a focus on symbolic politics and on conspiracy theories, drawing again on the Jews as scapegoats, which are constitutive also for anti-Muslim and anti-Roma and other sentiments and exclusion. Thus, in sum, we are experiencing tensions between globalizing economic, social, and cultural developments and exclusionary identity politics. Some are more deserving than others, and this leads to reinventing nationalism and especially drawing on past nativist ideologies. And what I find specifically scary is the revival of the Tina argument that there is no alternative. And I would like to stop here. I'm sorry to have talked longer, but the examples need to be really elaborated. Thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Professor Wodak. That was incredibly useful, fascinating and rich, and I think really has helped to kind of bring the conference and the kind of things we're discussing together. So we've got time for a couple of questions. I have my laptop here to see, so I can check if there's any in the chat on Zoom. But any questions first from the audience here at the Vienna Library in London? While everyone's thinking, I've just got a question that occurred to me, which is that you've talked about the strategies maybe of the far right through discourse and the ways in which these discourses get incorporated into perhaps the mainstream. Do you have any thoughts about how politicians trying to resist these or challenge these discourses could operate, any strategies that they could adopt in order to try and work against these kind of narratives?
Well, I think there are quite a few strategies which refer to various dimensions. On the one hand, many media collude with this kind of normalization, and it would be important if at least independent media, and that is a big problem because these illiberal or already authoritarian governments try to also suppress or oppress press freedom. But as long as there are independent media, they can voice alternatives, and they don't have to bring headlines every day about these slogans or arguments. They shouldn't sort of write every provocation or bring every provocation. You can also put provocations on page 10 and not on page 1. So this alliance, which we frequently observe between media and politics, I think that media have some possibilities, if they are independent, to work against this overwhelming normalization. And we've seen success in that in some countries where important media have not really reported everything which the normalizing processes have perhaps expected them to report. But I believe really that investigative journalism and independent journalism require enormous support right now because they are the tipping point. Yeah? I mean, they can really make a huge difference. The other issue is oppositional parties who have to basically position themselves with an alternative program. It's not just rhetoric, it's agenda. And if you want to work against the exclusion and the exclusionary rhetoric, as I have shown it on many dimensions, against inside and outside, and those above and those below, then you have to position yourself differently and also propose different policies. And this is where oppositional parties have to work. They also have to sell that well. They have to have good slogans, etc. But it's not just an issue of rhetoric, it's an issue of content. And I think that that has been lacking in some countries. Alternative voices have not been strong enough. You cannot just be against, you also have to propose something. So that, I think that's important. And if we now think of the pandemic and these demonstrations, I find them very scary because, especially in Austria, some of the police have already joined the demonstrators. And if the executive joins the anti-government and the anti-measures and so forth movement, this is really quite a scary trajectory. I mean, we've had such phenomena in the past. Thus, I think here civil society is really important. So we have, and legislation against hate incitement, against remobilizing insignia of Nazi symbols. And I know that some countries have laws against Holocaust denial, other countries don't. This is a huge debate which we could start, but I, for myself and my position, say I really find it scary to hear that on the streets, and I would prefer that being forbidden, but I'm sure there are other opinions.
Thank you very much. So a question from one of the co-conveners of the conference, Roland Clark. He says, young people are famous for having their own language with lots of neologisms. I can't pronounce it. New words. Do young far-right activists just repeat the same linguistic strategies of their elders, or are we seeing something new evolving as the far-right evolves through online forums?
I think both. On the one hand, as I've tried to show, that in this sort of antagonism between remembering and forgetting, yeah? They are drawing on collective memories and on past symbols, because otherwise you wouldn't have this revival of the Star of David or the Yellow Star, or slogans which are used in the demonstrations like a vaccination makes free, which obviously insinuates Arbeit macht frei from Auschwitz. So you have an absolute intentional and strategic drawing on past insignia and symbols. And on the other hand, there are new symbols, of course. And if you think of all these online fora and memes like the frog, which has become a big symbol in the States, or other new memes. So there is also a very creative, one could say, quote unquote, industry creating such memes. And we also see new words and new slogans evolving, again, drawing on old tropes like extinction, or the whole identitarian ideologies, but with some also new slogans and new words. So basically, I think those people are, quote unquote, quite clever, and they draw on advertising and lots of other strategies, and use whatever they find is really successful, and to attract young people, both history and future. So it's a toxic combination.
Thank you. So just time for a final question. So this is from Selson. Do you think that anti-vax protests will influence upcoming elections in Hungary and France, and that they will be instrumentalized by the populist radical right politicians?
Absolutely. I absolutely think that that will be part of the agenda. I mean, you cannot abstract from the pandemic. Obviously, the policies of the government will play a big role, of whatever respective government, and they will be trying to mobilize those anti-vax movements. But Hungary and France are very different in especially one respect. In Hungary, you have the far-right government. So, and Orban and Fidesz are responsible for the measures, so they cannot be against the measures. So the other groups might be against the measures, but they will have to account for a huge amount of death. Hungary has one of the highest proportionally numbers of deaths due to the pandemic, and a absolutely horrible and very destroyed health system. So Hungary is in a very different situation than, for example, France, where the anti-vax is against the government, because Macron and his Marche movement are not far right. So Marine Le Pen, but also the even more extreme right party will certainly mobilize anti-vax movements. They will also mobilize the Vest Jaune. So there are many sort of different movements which can be mobilized and instrumentalized against the norms and the measures in the government. So it will depend how successful now the French government is in coping with Omicron and the pandemic.
Thank you so much. Thank you for people who've asked questions. I'm really sorry if we haven't had time to get to your question. We're unfortunately out of time. So it just remains for me to say once again, thank you so much to Professor Wodak. We're really honoured to have you here today, and it was such a useful, fantastic contribution. So we'll be restarting again on a different Zoom link for our next panel, if you're joining us there. And we have another lecture by Professor Julie Gottlieb later on this evening, if you're joining us then. So look forward to seeing you all again. Thank you very much, and please join me in thanking Professor Wodak.
Thank you very much.